And this is one of the most controversial stories of the week. And it's one that needs a little background before you hear what the vice president has to say on it. So let's just rewind to Monday. Sounds like a million years ago, doesn't it? But on Monday, we got an announcement from the Department of Justice. And it was an announcement for a settlement on a lawsuit you may not even really be familiar with. Quite frankly, it was one that we had to review. January was a busy time. Remember Venezuela, Maduro, we had all the ICE situations, immigrations and customs enforcement, protests and operations throughout the country. There was a lot going on. Something else that happened in January at the end of the month is the president and his two sons and one of their business entities sued the US Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Why did they do that? They did that because they said that the IRS and the Treasury Department illegally released their tax returns. $10 billion was this civil lawsuit. This is what was at stake. Now, we haven't heard a lot about this case in the time between now and then. So this announcement on Monday was a bit of a surprise, and it was an announcement of a settlement. So settlement is usually a way that you have two opposing sides reaching an agreement, not having to go to court. And typically, it would suggest, past is precedent, that those that are suing that want something would get a payment of some sort as part of a settlement or get something in exchange. That did exactly happen here. The Trump family, the business entity, did not get anything per se. What is part of the settlement, though, is the announcement of the Anti-Weaponization Fund. The Anti-Weaponization Fund is a fund with $1.77 billion. And what it's supposed to do, as it sounds, is to provide resources, i.e., money, to those who believe that the federal government has been weaponized against them. President Trump has said this. The Trump family has said that they have been victims of this, specifically under the Biden administration. And what they're doing here in this way is saying, we're not going to take any money. What we want to do is create a fund where Americans, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter, can appeal to the fund and say, we have been wronged by the federal government. We've been targeted. It's been weaponized against us, and we have a claim. And they could receive money for that claim. Now, that's what we know about the Anti-Weaponization Fund, but we don't know a lot of specifics. We know that it's going to be a panel of 5 people. We don't know who those people are. We know that a person that sits on the panel could be removed by the president. We know that this fund would exist until December 2028. Note the date, right after the election. And that if there's leftover money in the fund, it could go to any number of departments, the Commerce Department, the Interior, or a part of the federal government that is deemed worthy to receive these extra funds. Who can actually apply for this? We don't know. How much money can someone get? We don't really know. What are some of the requirements around filing a claim? How do you prove that claim? What sort of time does it take if you say you have a claim before getting rejected or accepted? How does the panel work in the background? Is this a full-time job? Is this a part-time job? Can someone actually receive $1 billion and then there's $700 million left? We don't know a lot of these specifics. So there's a lot of questions, and knowing just that is important. Earlier in the day, before the vice president stepped in front of the White House press corps, the acting attorney general, Todd Blanche, was sitting before a Senate hearing. And with this news very fresh coming on Monday, when the acting attorney general sat down on Tuesday, he received quite a few questions from all sorts of folks on this topic, including 2 leading Democrats. And the summations of their questions summarize the critiques of this plan, early as it is in understanding what it is at all.
Mr. Attorney General, this is an outrageous, unprecedented slush fund that you set up. Simple question. Will individuals who assaulted Capitol Hill police officers be eligible for this fund?
Well, as it makes plain, anybody
just let me know if they're eligible for the fund.
As was made plain yesterday, anybody in this country is eligible to apply if they believe they were a victim of weaponization.
Mr. Attorney General, let me ask you this. Are there going to be rules that say that if you've assaulted a Capitol Hill police officer or committed a violent crime, you will not be eligible? Why not make that a rule?
I expect that because I'm not one of the commissioners setting up the rules. I expect that there will be rules.
You're appointing 4 of the 5 members, aren't you, Mr. Attorney General?
Pardon me?
You're appointing 4 of the 5 members.
I am appointing all 5 members.
You can certainly set up the rules. I would hope you would make a rule that anyone convicted of assaulting a police officer or a violent crime is simply not eligible. They should not apply.
President Trump is the first president to sue his own government and then direct his chosen acting attorney general to reach this kind of settlement, will you commit that none of President Trump's family will receive a direct payout from this fund?
Yes, but what you just said is not true. I mean, if I can correct that.
Please.
That the president did not direct me to do anything.
Has it ever happened that a sitting president sued his own government for $10 billion and then directed the settlement of the case and the establishment of a payout fund?
Not that I'm aware, but there's a lot of things that President Trump's the first of. No president had been indicted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Correct.
6, 7, 8 times either.
Correct. No president's been indicted. And will you commit that none of this money will go to President Trump's campaign donors?
I am not committing to anything beyond the settlement agreement itself. When you say campaign donors, that they are not excluded from seeking compensation.
Last
they were
question.
weaponized.
Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, asking some of the questions that there's some general understanding of what this fund could look like, but it is fairly unprecedented. In our reporting, we were trying to look for something to compare it to. The Department of Justice mentions one fund, but this is something that, quite frankly, I'm not as familiar with. And the process for which this would roll out, we really don't know. Just big picture, the Trump administration feels that the government, specifically the Justice Department, has been weaponized against not only President Trump, but other Americans that support him. In creating the Anti-Weaponization Fund, now the Trump administration is being accused of weaponizing the Justice Department and the government. And so now we have the accusations flying multiple directions. So let's return back to the White House press briefing. Remember, Vice President Vance, one of his areas that he's focused on is not just Iran. He's also been named head of a task force dealing and addressing government fraud, specifically having to do with government money being used in unethical ways. So now he's at the podium. We have this news, and he's getting some tough questions on it. Let's take a listen. This is Jonathan Karl from ABC News.
Mr. Vice President, thank you. I want to ask you about that $1.8 billion fund set up, weaponization fund as it's being called. Why should taxpayers be paying to settle a $10 billion lawsuit that was brought by the President of the United States? And should people that attacked the Capitol building and assaulted police officers, should they be eligible? Should they receive money? Should they receive money from this fund?
Well, let me say a couple things about that. First, John, I think in some ways the media has misrepresented what this is actually about. This is about compensating Americans for the lawfare that we saw under the last administration. And by the way, anybody can apply for it. Republicans can apply for it. Democrats can apply for it. As you know, the President of the United States has pardoned a number of Democrats who he felt were actually subject to this lawfare. I mean, if Hunter Biden wants to apply for this particular fund, he is welcome to. It's going to go through a normal process where we vet everything, where we try to identify whether people's claims are actually legitimate. But here's the question. You say, why should taxpayers fund this? Whenever the United States government incurs legal expenses, it pays out those legal expenses. When it's settling a lawsuit, it pays out money to settle that lawsuit. And the question is a dollar of this money going to the Trump administration? No. Is a dollar of this money going to Donald Trump personally? No. Is a dollar of this money going to Donald Trump's family? No. The people that would get the money are people, some of whom have been prosecuted completely disproportionate to any crime they've ever committed.
Okay, so this is the argument coming from the White House. You can hear it as well. And the acting attorney general, as well as the vice president, saying, listen, this fund's open to anybody. Hunter Biden can apply to this fund. We don't know exactly what the qualifications would be or if he would get accepted, but he could apply. This is for everybody because we feel like this is an important issue. And the pushback is, well, everybody? Now, did you notice that similarity between what the Democrats on Capitol Hill were asking about and then what Jonathan Karl was asking about, as well as Caitlin Collins for CNN and others of major networks? They were really focused on January 6th and those that have been prosecuted for January 6th, activities involving January 6th. As you know, President Trump has pardoned this group. And so the question that Democrats are focused on is, well, does everyone qualify? Would that group qualify? If we could take that 10x, if you have a record of any kind, do you qualify? Like, how do you determine who actually gets to file a claim? I just want to point out, this is a part of the media that as a member of the press, we need to be aware of. When I hear Democrats on Capitol Hill ask a question hours earlier before that same question is asked in the press briefing room on the very same topic. Remember, we heard, the senators are asking about January 6th. Then we have members of the press asking about January 6th. January 6th is a small portion of the US population, but it's a similar focus for two of these groups. What would have been better for members of the press here if they were curious, if they had heard this from Democrats on Capitol Hill, said, well, we heard from senators such and such and such and such, and this is what they're asking about. What's your response to that? Then it looks like the press is independently thinking or at least resourcing their questions. When we ask very similar questions to lawmakers and don't source the reason why we're asking them, then it looks like we're just rinse and repeating a certain talking point. And we want to make sure as members of the press that we're independent. And as you know, at Smart News, we're nonpartisan with no political agenda. It's very easy to look like you have a political agenda if you're asking the same questions as lawmakers without giving them the proper sourcing for that. Now, it's also true that members of the press may arrive at the same questions as lawmakers. And I don't know if Jonathan Karl or Caitlin Collins or any of these groups were actually listening to the acting attorney general testify in the Senate before they headed to the White House press briefing. I think it's 50-50. It was a big event to watch, and maybe they were watching and that helped inform their question, or maybe they just were thinking about it themselves. But it's just a word of caution. If you notice that pattern, we have to ask ourselves, are they just happen to be thinking the same thing, or are they repeating a talking point? And this is why we can feel that the press is biased. And that's something that I personally believe that you should have a lot of options for unbiased, nonpartisan press, which is why we exist. So thank you for your support. But I just wanted to point that out because there's striking similarities. And if you heard them, I didn't want to ignore them. So again, we have this story in front of us. And it's a big one. That's a lot of money, $1.77 billion. And a question about how exactly it's going to be distributed and whether or not it is actually going to be distributed in a partisan or political way that serves the administration during an election cycle, the midterms coming up and a presidential cycle ahead. And what does that look like? The question that I believe we should be asking is why now? Why did the administration, why did the Justice Department decide on Monday to announce this? We got a lot happening. Why Monday? And why right before the acting attorney general testifies before Congress, knowing full well that the senators cannot ignore this? They're going to have to ask the questions. And is that part of a strategy of some sort to try to drive the news cycle or the conversation away from other topics and onto a new topic that then gets a lot of attention? I have no way of knowing behind the scenes if there's a strategy to this. And I'll tell you something, there's a lot of thinking about the sophistication of strategies in different areas of government. It's been my experience that sometimes things are sort of coincidental or maybe not even thought through necessarily. So I'm not alleging that. I'm just simply asking the question. So we're releasing it on Monday. We have the acting attorney general of the Justice Department that's in charge of this panel testifying on Tuesday. And then a couple hours after him, we have the vice president who heads up a task force on fraud, specifically dealing with government money, stepping to the podium in the White House to answer questions. So either the acting attorney general and the vice president just got a tough draw here. And just by chance are having to answer questions that they're specifically have a very specific position related to, or it's just sort of a coincidence. But that's the question I have, which is why now? This case was just a few months old. There's already a settlement reached. What is this? Is this part of something else? Is something happening behind the scenes that we need to know more about? And if I was asking someone about this off the record on background so that I could do a little extra reporting, that would be the question that I would ask. Because we went from not talking about any of this to suddenly having a news cycle that's dominated by it, with a lot of questions coming from our Smart News community on it, which is one of the reasons why I took a closer look at this story. So thank you very much for that.